The year is 1938. A cattle car rolls east across the Ural Mountains, packed with men whose only crime was existing in Stalin's Soviet Union at the wrong moment. Inside, the air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, human waste, and something else. Fear, so concentrated it has a taste. Metallic, sharp, real. These men, 76 of them crammed into a space designed for 40, have been traveling for 3 weeks. They don't know where they're going. They don't know why they were arrested. They only know that when the train finally stops, when the doors finally open, their lives as human beings will effectively end. What waits for them isn't death. Death would be mercy. What waits for them is the Gulag, the Soviet forced labor camp system that consumed over 18 million lives between 1930 and 1953. And inside those camps, the guards had perfected something far more terrible than execution. They had learned how to keep you alive, working, suffering, long after you wished for death. Long after death would have been the humane option. This isn't speculation. This is documented in NKVD internal reports, in survivor testimonies collected by Memorial International, in the secret journals of guards who later defected. What Soviet guards did to Gulag prisoners wasn't the result of chaos or loss of control. It was systematic. It was policy. It was worse than you can imagine. If you've ever wondered why survivors of the Gulag rarely spoke about their experiences even decades after Stalin's death, you're about to understand why. Here, we examine the archived testimonies, the declassified documents from Moscow's State Archive of the Russian Federation. The survivor accounts that organizations like Memorial risked everything to preserve before Putin's government shut them down in 2021. Every view helps keep these voices alive. Now let's follow that cattle car to its destination, because the doors are about to open, and what happens next will make you question everything you thought you knew about human cruelty. When the train finally stops, the location is Kolyma, a region in Russia's Far East so remote, so hostile to human life, that even the native Yakut people avoided it. Winter temperatures drop to 60 C. Summer brings clouds of mosquitoes so thick they can suffocate a man. The ground is permanently frozen, permafrost extending hundreds of meters deep. Nothing grows here except scattered tundra moss. This is where the Soviet Union sent prisoners to mine gold. Not because Kolyma was the only place with gold, but because Kolyma was the perfect place to break human beings. The system, documented in countless NKVD operational orders, was elegantly simple. Prisoners were divided into categories based on their work output. Category of prisoners who met 100 of their assigned quota received 700 grams of bread per day and a bowl of soup. Category B prisoners who met 75-99 received 500 grams of bread. Category C prisoners who met less than 75 received 300 grams of bread and watery broth. Here's where the mathematics of death becomes clear. A man doing hard physical labor in extreme cold requires approximately 3,000 calories per day to maintain his body weight and strength. The category A ration provided roughly 1,200 calories. Category B provided about 800. Category C provided barely 400. No prisoner could maintain Category A performance on Category A rations. The caloric deficit guaranteed that within weeks, even the strongest workers would slip to Category B, then Category C. And once you reached Category C, you were on what prisoners called the express train to the graveyard. But here's the calculated cruelty at the heart of the system. The guards didn't shoot Category C prisoners. That would be too quick, too merciful, and it would reduce the labor force. Instead, they kept them working, put them in the coldest mine shafts, assigned them the hardest tasks, and watched as their bodies consumed themselves burning muscle for fuel, until they collapsed. Varlam Shalamov, a writer who survived 17 years in Kolyma, later wrote in his Kolyma Tales, "A man in the gold mines of Kolyma lasted 3 weeks before becoming a goner." That was the camp term. Not dead, goner, because death took longer. You became a skeleton that moved, worked, suffered, but was no longer quite alive. Shalamov described watching men's bodies betray them in systematic stages. First went the fat, dissolved within days. Then the muscle mass, consumed by a body desperate for fuel. The face hollowed out, eyes sinking deep into skulls. The body, trying desperately to preserve core functions, shut down non-essential systems. Wounds stopped healing. Teeth fell out from scurvy. The fingers and toes went numb, then black from frostbite. And still, the guards made them work. Eugenia Ginsburg, arrested in 1937 and sent to Kolyma, documented her experience in her memoir Journey into the Whirlwind. She described a moment that revealed the true nature of the system. A woman collapsed in the mine shaft. The guard, a young man not much older than 20, ordered her to stand. She couldn't. He kicked her, not in anger. That was the most horrifying part. He kicked her the way you might kick a broken machine, testing to see if it would start working again. When she still didn't move, he shrugged and moved on. She froze to death where she lay, and we stepped over her body for 3 days before they finally carried it away. This wasn't a rogue guard acting out of sadism. This was protocol. Internal NKVD orders from 1937, declassified in 2003, explicitly stated that guards were not to waste ammunition on prisoners who collapsed unless they posed a security risk. The cold, the hunger, the work itself would complete the execution. Why waste a bullet? But Kolyma, as horrific as it was, operated under one consistent principle. You worked until you couldn't, then you died. There were other camps where the torture was more psychological, more deliberately designed to destroy the human mind before the body gave out. Vorkuta, the coal mining camp in Russia's Arctic north, perfected this approach. In Vorkuta, guards used a technique called the punishment cell, or cold box. It was exactly what it sounds like. A concrete cell, 1.5 meters by 1 meter, no heating, no light, no blankets. In winter, temperatures inside reached 40 C. Prisoners were placed inside wearing only thin prison uniforms. They were given no food, only 1 cup of water every 48 hours. The official maximum sentence was 15 days. Few survived more than 7. Gustav Herling, a Polish prisoner who was sent to a similar camp near Arkhangelsk, described the cold box in his book A World Apart. You don't just feel the cold enters you. It becomes part of your bones, your organs, your mind. After 2 days, you stop shivering. That's when you know you're dying. Your body has given up trying to generate warmth. You're frozen from the inside out. But here's the calculation that makes this worse than execution. The guards knew exactly how long a man could survive in the cold box based on his physical condition. Strong, healthy prisoners might last 10 days. Weakened prisoners might last 3. So they calibrated the punishment. 5 days for a strong prisoner was enough to break him without killing him. 2 days for a weak one. They'd pull you out just before death, revive you, let you recover for a week, and then send you back to work, broken, obedient, terrified of being sent back. A former NKVD guard named Ivan Chistyakov, who defected to Finland in 1942, gave testimony to Finnish intelligence that was later deposited in the Finnish National Archives. He described the cold box protocol with chilling precision. We had orders to check on the prisoners every 8 hours. We'd shine a light through the door slot. If they were still moving, we left them. If they weren't moving but were still breathing, we had to decide. Were they faking? Were they close to death? If we thought they were faking, we'd leave them longer. If we thought they were dying, we'd pull them out. But the thing is, we didn't always get it right. Sometimes we'd pull out a body, stone cold and dead, and realize we'd miscalculated. Other times we'd leave someone in there thinking they were faking, and they'd actually be dying. We lost prisoners both ways, but mostly we got it right. We knew the signs. We'd done it enough times. Think about that. The cold box wasn't a punishment that might kill you. It was a punishment calibrated to nearly kill you, stopping just short of death through a guard's educated guess based on past experience watching people freeze. In Vorkuta, another technique was even more psychologically devastating. It was called the escort detail. Here's how it worked. A prisoner would be told they were being transferred to another camp. This was initially good news, because any change in the Gulag system might mean improvement. The prisoner would be taken from their barracks, handed over to 2 guards, and told to walk. They'd walk for hours through the tundra, following paths only the guards knew. After several hours, the guards would stop, check a document, and tell the prisoner there had been an error. They needed to return to the original camp, so they'd turn around and walk back. After another few hours, they'd arrive back at the camp. The prisoner would be processed back in, exhausted, confused, but relieved to have shelter again. The next day it would happen again. Same guards, same walk, same turnaround, same return. This would continue for days, sometimes weeks. The prisoner, already weakened from camp rations, would be walked to the point of collapse and back, day after day, with no explanation. Sometimes the guards would tell them they were going to be released. Sometimes they'd say nothing. Sometimes they'd hint at execution. The psychological toll was devastating. Prisoners never knew if today was the day they'd actually be transferred, released, or shot. They walked in a fog of exhaustion and terror, their minds breaking long before their bodies gave out. A Soviet psychiatrist named Lazar Pistrak, who was imprisoned in Vorkuta from 1944 to 1947, and later emigrated to the United States, wrote about the escort detail in a 1967 academic paper on trauma. The cruelty was in the uncertainty, he explained. The human mind can adapt to almost any horror if it understands the rules. But when the rules change every day, when you can't predict whether the next hour will bring release or execution, the mind simply fractures. I treated prisoners who had been on escort details. Many never recovered their sanity, even after release. They would wake up every morning expecting guards to tell them to walk. But perhaps the most systematically cruel practice in the Gulag system was one that the Soviet authorities never officially acknowledged, yet was documented in hundreds of survivor testimonies. It was called the Slow Death Brigade, and it existed in camps across the system, from Kolyma to Vorkuta to Norilsk. The Slow Death Brigade was where guards placed prisoners who were too weak to meet work quotas, but not quite dead enough to be written off. These men and women were given impossible tasks. They were sent to clear forests with handsaws that barely cut. They were ordered to move tons of rock using only their hands and crude baskets. They were assigned to drainage ditches and swamps where the water was freezing and the mud was chest deep. The guards knew these prisoners couldn't complete their tasks. That wasn't the point. The point was to keep them working, keep them suffering, until their bodies finally gave up. It was execution by assigned impossibility. and it allowed the camp administration to maintain official statistics, showing that no prisoners were being executed. All deaths were from natural causes: exhaustion, cold, disease, and all prisoners were working until the moment they died. Enos Bardach, a Polish medical student arrested in 1941 and sent to Kolyma, described the slow death brigade in his memoir Man is Wolf to Man. They called it the forestry detail, but we called it the death brigade. We were sent into the forest with broken tools to cut timber. The quota was impossible to meet even with proper equipment. With what we had, it was suicide. Men would swing axes until their hands were bloody stumps. They'd saw at trees until they collapsed from exhaustion. And the guards would stand there, watching, counting, recording in their ledgers. That prisoner 847 worked 7 hours before succumbing to heart failure. Heart failure, as if it was natural, as if we hadn't been worked to death deliberately. The mathematics of the Gulag weren't hidden from the prisoners. Everyone understood the system. You started at Category A if you were lucky. You slipped to Category B within weeks. You fell to Category C within months. And once you reached Category C, you had maybe 3 weeks before your body shut down completely. The guards didn't have to kill you. The system did it automatically. But here's what makes this worse than execution. In an execution, there's a moment where it ends. A bullet, a noose, a blade. One moment you exist, the next you don't. In the Gulag, there was no such moment. Death came gradually, over weeks and months. You watched your body betray you, piece by piece. You felt your mind slipping away as malnutrition affected your ability to think, to remember, to hope. You became a goner while still technically alive. And the worst part was, you knew it was happening. You could see yourself disappearing, and there was nothing you could do to stop it. Nadezhda Mandelstam, widow of the poet Osip Mandelstam, who died in a transit camp in 1938, wrote about this psychological destruction in her memoir Hope Against Hope. They didn't want martyrs, she explained. Martyrs inspire resistance. They wanted broken people. People who would sign any confession, denounce any friend, betray any principle, just for the possibility of one more day of life. And the Gulag gave them that possibility. Always just out of reach. Work harder, and you'll get more food. Inform on your fellow prisoners and you'll get lighter duties. Survive another day and maybe tomorrow will be better. It never was. But the hope that it might be, that's what kept people working until they literally dropped dead. The most chilling documents from the Gulag system aren't the execution orders or the death statistics. They're the internal efficiency reports. In 1941, the NKVD completed an internal audit of the Kolyma camps, declassified in 2007. The report, written in dry bureaucratic language, analyzed the optimal lifespan of a prisoner to maximize gold production while minimizing resource expenditure. The conclusion? A prisoner who arrived at Kolyma in good health could be worked at maximum efficiency for approximately 90 days before caloric deficit began to significantly impact productivity. After 90 days, reduced rations would extend their useful life for another 30-60 days at lower productivity levels. Total productive lifespan, approximately 4-5 months. The report recommended that prisoners be transported to Kolyma in early summer to maximize work during the brief warm season, then be allowed to die off during winter when mining operations were reduced anyway. This would minimize food costs during non-productive months while ensuring a fresh supply of workers the following summer. Human beings reduced to a mathematical equation. Lives measured in cubic meters of gold ore extracted per day, multiplied by days of productivity, minus the cost of rations. And here's the most horrifying realization. This system worked exactly as designed. The Gulag produced approximately 1,300 tons of gold between 1932 and 1954. It built the White Sea-Baltic Canal, the Baikal-Amur Railway, and countless other Soviet infrastructure projects. It did this using prisoners who were worked until they died, at a rate of approximately 1.6 million deaths over 23 years. That's roughly 191 deaths per day, every day, for more than 2 decades. And most of those deaths weren't from bullets or execution. They were from exhaustion, starvation, cold and disease, systematically induced by a system that understood exactly how to keep human beings alive and working just long enough to extract maximum labor before they collapsed. The guards weren't monsters. That's the part that keeps you awake at night. They were ordinary men, mostly young, often poorly educated, following orders and believing, or convincing themselves they believed, that these prisoners were enemies of the people who deserved their fate. Ivan Chistyakov, the defector whose testimony was mentioned earlier, said something in his Finnish intelligence interview that cuts to the heart of this horror. We didn't think of them as people. If you thought of them as people, you couldn't do the job. So they became numbers, production units, quotas to be met. When one died, another arrived on the next transport. It was like working in a factory. Parts wear out. You replace them. That's all it was. Except they weren't parts. They were human beings. Fathers, sons, brothers, mothers, daughters, sisters, writers, scientists, teachers, farmers. People whose only crimes, in many cases, were existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. People who were systematically destroyed not because the Soviet state wanted them dead, but because it wanted their labor. And their deaths were merely the predictable endpoint of the extraction process. That's what Soviet guards did to Gulag prisoners that was worse than death. They made death slow. They made it inevitable. They made it a process you had to live through while watching yourself disappear. And then they wrote it all down in neat bureaucratic reports, filed in archives in Moscow, and called it building socialism. The Gulag system officially ended in 1960. The camps were dismantled. The survivors, those few who lived long enough to see Stalin die and the system collapse, were released with minimal documentation of where they'd been, or what they'd endured. Most never spoke about their experiences. How do you explain to someone who wasn't there that death would have been mercy? How do you describe watching yourself disappear, piece by piece, while guards took notes and updated production quotas? You can't. So they stayed silent. And the world, eager to move past Soviet atrocities, let that silence stand. Until survivors like Shalamov and Ginsburg and Bardach decided that silence was worse than memory. That forgetting was a betrayal of everyone who died in those camps. So they wrote. And organizations like Memorial preserved their testimonies. And slowly, the truth emerged. Not the sanitized version. The real truth. The documented horror of a system that understood exactly how to break human beings and did it efficiently, systematically, and legally for more than 2 decades. If you've heard this story and it stays with you, that's appropriate. Some truths aren't meant to be comfortable. Leave a comment. Tell us what you think about a system that could reduce human life to a mathematical equation. And if you want more documented accounts from the darkest corners of history, subscribe, because the only thing worse than remembering these horrors is forgetting that they happened.